All right, we're going to get started. Good morning. Thank you all so much for being with us this morning for the next edition, today's big edition of our Nerd Talk series, New Education Research and Data. We're really excited to have the time this morning to dig into the newly released NAEP results and what they mean for Tennessee. I'm David Mansuri. I serve as President, CEO, and SCORE, and really excited to have my colleague Alexis Parker, our Director of Data, with us for our conversation today. And really just, I want to start with a couple of sort of quick high level notes on what we're going to cover today. We're going to walk through a bit just around Tennessee's NAEP history and why the nation's report card as a measurement is so important for Tennessee and has been so important for Tennessee. We'll spend a good bit of time digging into the data, what we saw this week, why that matters, and some key insights from that data. And then we'll spend some time at the end in Q&A. Just note up top, if you have any questions as we go through the presentation today, as Lexi's walking through the data, feel free to drop it into the chat box. We'll make sure to get to as many questions as we can before the end of our time together. And so again, as things pop up, as you have questions or thoughts as we go through the data, feel free to drop it into the chat box, and we'll make sure to get to those questions and insights before the end of our conversation today. So I want to start with just a little bit of a reflection on NAEP and why it matters for Tennessee. So Tennessee has a long history with the nation's report card as a benchmark for continuous improvement in the state. In 2007, Tennessee received an F for truth in advertising on student achievement when there really was a staggering honesty gap between performance on the state assessment, where more than 90% of students were proficient, compared to results on the NAEP assessment, where only about a quarter of Tennessee students were proficient. That really served as a call to arms in many ways. Tennessee raised academic expectations for students, put in place a number of really targeted policies and investments. And in 2013, on that same national assessment, Tennessee was named the fastest improving state in the country. We have continued to make steady progress, catching up to national averages through 2019. And then we all know that the pandemic-related disruptions caused a lot of impacts on student learning in 2020, 2021. And we witnessed, like many states did, like perhaps all states did, some pretty dramatic declines on NAEP, again, along with the rest of the country in 2022. And so for the last 5 years, as you all know, we as a state have spent really focused time, attention, energy, prioritizing student-focused policies, research-backed interventions that are supporting student learning and the recovery from some of the impacts that we saw in the 2022 NAEP results. And so this year, the 2024 NAEP results, which were just released this week, for the first time, Tennessee now scores above the national average in both 4th and 8th grade ELA and math. And we just think this is a remarkable story of a focus, investment, prioritization of education and improved student outcomes, and of really recovery from some of the challenges that we saw in student outcomes over the last few years. And we want to just sort of start, not to bury the lead here, with where Tennessee ranks today. And again, I just think this is a remarkable story. Tennessee now is ranked 13th in the nation in 4th grade math, 21st in the nation in 8th grade reading. We'll obviously go through more of this data in just a second, but among Black students in our state, Tennessee ranks 1st in the country in 8th grade math. And these results really should make all Tennesseans, including Tennessee educators, policymakers, philanthropic partners, state and local leaders, really proud. The student-focused policies, investments, and really strong, consistent implementation that the state has had are paying off for students and are setting us on a path to even better outcomes for students moving forward. And as you'll see in the results, while we've made significant progress, I think we also all would argue that the progress is not enough. Again, even though we've made significant improvements relative to other states, our achievement for all students is still not where we want it to be. So we'll spend just a little bit of time this morning also talking about where we have more work to do, even as we've seen significant progress. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lexi Parker to walk through the detail on the data here. Again, thank you all for being with us. And I just would say up top, thanks to all of you for the work that you've done to help our state see these really tremendous gains in results for students, and the work I know you will do moving forward to help our students rise to even higher levels of achievement. So Lexi, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. Welcome again, everyone. I'm so excited to have you all joining us to talk about the data today. And as David gave some of that context of Tennessee's history with NAEP, I also want to make sure that folks understand what data we're talking about today, what NAEP actually tracks, and how it's being reported. So we really understand these insights that we're going to dig into. Again, as David mentioned, as you have questions throughout, please drop them in the Q&A feature in the Zoom call, and we'll be monitoring those throughout, and then again, having that full Q&A at the end. So what is NAEP? NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or sometimes called the Nation's Report Card. It is the only assessment where we can measure student learning at the national and state level and be able to make comparisons between states across the country. And so NAEP produces results for all 50 states, the Department of Defense education systems, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. And so we'll be looking at how Tennessee compares to the nation as a whole today. NAEP produces measures on overall student performance, as well as breakdowns by key demographic groups that we'll be digging into. We'll be able to see that change in achievement over time, as David touched on. How has Tennessee improved over the last 15 years, as well as differences between different jurisdictions, including the state level. I do want to note previously, Memphis-Shelby County has been a part of the Trial Urban District Assessment through NAEP. That may be familiar to some folks on the call. Memphis-Shelby County was not part of that kind of separate assessment this year, so we will not have data on that piece today. We'll be focusing on Tennessee's performance at the state level. So really excited to dig in. So how does NAEP actually identify test takers? If you did not know, every student in the state of Tennessee does not take NAEP. Only a select handful that are randomly sampled to create a representative sample of our full state end up taking the NAEP assessment. And so in Tennessee, that's about 1,800 students across 90 schools that take grade 4 ELA in math and grade 8 ELA in math NAEP assessments. These tests took place from January to March of 2024. And really that starts at a process of identifying all the eligible schools in Tennessee and making sure that NAEP is sampling schools that have a representative coverage of our state. So that is making sure that we cover our rural schools, our schools that have large populations of students of color or economically disadvantaged students, and then randomly sampling students within those schools to make sure that we can really represent our overall state as a whole. And we do see that compared to our TCAP data, NAEP results look very, very similar now. So that honesty gap that David mentioned has closed, which is great to see. So as we get into this, we'll talk about a few different ways that NAEP results are reported. You'll hear me use the words scale scores, achievement level, and rankings today. So for a scale score on NAEP, that is the scale 0 to 500, your actual kind of test score is how we can think of that. And with scale scores, we actually cannot compare those across grade levels or subjects. So a scale score in math can look very different than a scale score in reading, just because those thresholds are a little different. Primarily today, we'll be talking about achievement levels, and particularly students who are at or above proficient. So this will feel the most familiar to what we usually see when we're talking about TCAP results, just a percent of students proficient on math and reading. As David already alluded to, we'll be talking a bit about rankings today. When we're talking about those rankings, those are based on scale scores. You can also do that based on proficiency. And then we'll be talking about how we rank when looking at growth over time as well. Just monitoring the Q&A here. We've got a couple questions coming in. So great questions from the chat. Do sample students take both the NAEP assessment in addition to TCAP? So in our state, all students take the TCAP assessment, whereas only a select few would take NAEP. So any student who is showing up in these NAEP results would have also taken TCAP. Great question. And then finally, do private school students take NAEP? That is correct. Private schools do participate in NAEP. However, those results are only shared at the national level. And so as a state, we'll be only looking at public school results today. And so we're going to dig into how NAEP has changed over time in just a few moments. So first, if you want to dig in more beyond today's data, highly recommend you check out NAEP has a great data explorer as well as state profiles where you can really dig into the Tennessee specific data more. So highly recommend folks check out if you have more questions after this webinar. And without further ado, let's jump into the data. So I want to share some key insights, and then we'll spend the next few minutes walking through kind of what these mean and breaking them down a little bit further. But first, for the first time, Tennessee has surpassed the national average across all 4 assessments. So that's grade 4 and 8 math and reading. So we are now above the national average in all 4 areas. We also showed growth across all 4 assessments in a year where across the nation, we actually saw declines in many areas. So this is really important. Tennessee is kind of bucking that national trend, showing that recovery since 2022, when as a nation, we saw most of our scores kind of stay stagnant or decline. And that resulted in Tennessee ranking in the top 10 of states for improvement since 2022. Historically underserved groups show promising growth. Specifically, as David mentioned, Black students have really impressive results this year, as well as growth from English learners. However, we are still seeing widening achievement gaps that we are seeing the top performers kind of driving this growth, while the lowest performers continue to fall further behind. And without that really intentional focus on students who need the most support, we will continue to see proficiency rates that are still below our aspirations for students in the state. So let's dig into this first insight. Tennessee growth is surpassing national trends. You can see here, we're just looking at grade 4, reading on the left and math on the right. You can see that, we'll look at reading first. As a nation, again, scores have continued to decline. And Tennessee kind of completely flipped that on its head and actually showed growth this year across both subjects, outpacing the nation. Really, really exciting, showing data above the national average across both reading and math. And while David mentioned some rankings at the top, I do want to also flag that while we are, for example, ranked 13th in grade 4 math, only 4 states are significantly outperforming Tennessee in math. So really, really exciting here that while that ranking shows that we're about 13th or 24th, very few states have scores that are significantly above where Tennessee is today. So really exciting data there. Next, we'll look at the same chart, but for 8th grade. And again, you can see that we are kind of surpassing those national averages. While as a nation, we're staying pretty stagnant or having minimal growth, Tennessee is showing outsized gains for students, leading to really nearly record high performance. You can see in 8th grade math, we are now caught up to those 2019 high proficiency rates, and we're getting back to those highs in 8th grade reading as well. So I want to look at this kind of by subject. What's the trend for Tennessee compared to the nation? And you can see here that across all grades and subjects, as I mentioned, Tennessee is showing huge growth, particularly in math, where the nation in many of these areas is declining overall. So really, really important that we are continuing to have a strong focus on this data and celebrate the wins that Tennessee has. However, I'm going to go back really quick. We know that 1 in 3 Tennessee students proficient is not where we need to be as a state. And so it's really promising that we're seeing these gains, but we want to make sure that those proficiency rates also increase to where we know they need to be for students to be successful in life. So when we're looking at this kind of growth compared to the nation, we see that Tennessee ranks in the top 10 for states improvement since 2022. So this is a change in that kind of scale score rating. And you can see that in 4th grade math, we rank number 9, and in 4th grade reading, we rank number 7 in improvement. For 8th grade math, we rank number 1 in improvement and number 2 for improvement in 8th grade reading since 2022. So this recovery is really leading the nation here, and really exciting growth for Tennessee. Now, I want to show a chart that may look a little familiar to some folks who have been in this space for a while. And so here we'll look at this kind of improvement for 8th grade math in particular. When you're looking at this across the whole nation, you can see that Tennessee really pops in this kind of bright green section here, where we have a really high change in our scale score compared to other states. And again, ranking number 1 in the nation for improvement in 8th grade math since 2022. So really impressive growth here. Just quickly monitoring the chat. We can see that and when we're talking about proficiency rate in NAEP, that is based on those scale scores. So for each scale score, we have a kind of set threshold of proficiency that's mapped onto the standards there. Folks would love to know if we'll receive a copy of this presentation. We will have a presentation sent out to folks after this call, as well as the recording. So please look out for that. Again, folks, keep sending in those questions. We'll monitor as we go through. So we'll move on to our next insight here, specifically looking at Black students in Tennessee and the promising growth that we're seeing. You can see Black students is this green line there at the bottom, and really tremendous growth across grade 4 reading and grade 8 math, 2 subjects that we know are really key for student success. Black students have grown tremendously and slightly narrowed these gaps between Black and white students. This is really, really promising. However, we can see on this chart that the gap in proficiency rates remains about 20 points between Black and white students. And we see that our Hispanic students this year did show declines and stagnation across grades and subjects. So really, really important that we continue to dig into these gaps and make sure that not only are we closing these gaps, but we're bringing students up to the high proficiency rates that we need. I do want to spend a moment, though, celebrating the growth that we are seeing for our Black students in the state. Really excitingly, Tennessee ranks in the top 10 for Black student performance overall, and in the top 5 for growth across all grades and subjects since 2022. So really, really impressive. Next, we'll break down some additional student group data. And you can see here that, as I mentioned at the top, English learners have shown really, really promising growth from the last NAEP administration to this year, with gains of over 10 points in grade 4 math, grade 8 reading, and grade 8 math. Again, some other things I want to point out here. We also saw some promising gains for economically disadvantaged students in grade 4 math and grade 8 reading, as well as for our students in urban districts across grade 4 math, grade 8 reading, and grade 8 math. Some really promising gains there. However, 2 areas that I want to draw continued focus to. We saw that students with disabilities showed declines across all grades and subjects. As well, our students in rural schools showed declines across the majority of grades and subjects as well. So while there's a lot to celebrate here, and many of our students are showing really, really promising growth, there are still a few areas that we need to continue to focus on. And again, making sure that those overall proficiency rates are brought up. Finally, I want to talk about what's kind of driving this gap and this change. So we can see that this chart is looking at the 10th percentile of test takers and the 90th percentile. So students performing at the top versus lower performers. And you can see here that since 2009, across both grade 4 reading and grade 8 math, but this is true across all grades and subjects, we're seeing the gap between our highest and lowest performers continually widen. So the growth that we're seeing as a state is primarily being driven by our highest performers, while our students who need the most support are falling further and further behind, with these gaps growing about 20 points overall just since 2009. So as we continue to think about what's next, how we continue to reach our dreams and keep growing for these students, we are really focused on high impact strategies that we have continued to prioritize over the last 15 years that we are hopeful will really serve these lowest performing students. Monitoring the Q&A real quick. Perfect. So we have one question on the statewide focus of science of reading and how that has helped achievement in reading. David, curious if you have any thoughts on that. We'll also officially move into our Q&A section. So please drop comments in the chat. David and I will be monitoring and answering those questions.
Yeah, just on that question, really great question. I'll just say it's hard to know exactly what's led to these gains, but I do think based on research, practice, and just observation here, I think we would say that the state's focus on early literacy, on high quality instructional materials, and higher quality curriculum, on strong teacher training and support in early grades literacy, really this whole focus on improving the way that we are teaching reading in the early grades, we certainly think has led to some of these really impressive gains relative to our peers across the country. So definitely think that like focus on phonics and knowledge-rich curriculum has been an important part of the state's improvement in early grades reading. And I think we would also say that's sort of a critical area for continued prioritization and implementation and sort of long-term sustainability of that work.
Seeing some more questions come in the Q&A. People asking about how rural is defined. So these kind of rural and urban distinctions are based on the National Center of Education Statistics geography locale codes. And so that is a national definition for rural. Happy to follow up with more information on that, but that is a national definition that we use. David, looks like we have a question for you in the chat as well. What additional strategies can we see to kind of close gaps between these students? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So, I mean, I think what we would say is a lot of the things that have been put in place the last couple of years, we're still really in the first couple of years of implementation. So the work around early grades, literacy, high quality instructional materials, in particular, I think are areas where we're still sort of early into the implementation of those priorities. So we definitely think sort of long-term sustained prioritization of that work is really important. One of the things that we were excited to see in these results is the improvement in math. And I think that's obviously another area that's been increasingly an area of focus for the state that we'd like to see more a focus on moving forward as well. And then I think some of the things that I would just note in this data, if you think about long-term prioritization, is just the state's overall focus on effective teaching, setting high expectations for students and then reaching those expectations, measuring student data regularly and assessing student progress. Those are all things that we think are just sort of part of this continued improvement and continued progress for Tennessee, and that we'd like to see really a sustained focus on for the state moving forward. Lexi, there's one question here you might be able to answer around what student groups are mostly in the 10th percentile. You may have a thought or two on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're looking at the 10th percentile scores, We don't know exactly the breakdown of what students are within that 10th percentile. However, if we go back in some of the data here, we can see that for our students of color, Hispanic and Black students, those proficiency rates are not where we need them to be. And so we want to make sure that when we're thinking about students who need the most supports, that we are thinking about those historically disadvantaged student groups, including our students of color, our ED students, and our English learners, as well as our students with disabilities. Again, really seeing these kind of declines across subjects is a real concern for students with disabilities when those proficiency rates are already hovering around 10%. And so really, really important that we continue to think about those student groups as well. Great question.
Lexi, there's a question in the chat about the performance of Black students in 8th grade math. Could you talk a little bit about what we see there? Yeah.
So when we're looking at 8th grade math here, again, you can see here on this table that Black students are #1 in overall performance. So that is compared to Black students in every other state across the country. Our scale score performance is the highest. And so that's really exciting. For this growth, that is showing the change in scale score from 2022 to 2024. So Black students in Tennessee also ranked the highest there, specifically for grade 8 math. Great question. Also, again, want to confirm that the data from Memphis Shelby County is not available this year for NAEP. They were not included in that data this year.
Lexi, do we know, I know Memphis Shelby County wasn't included in the urban district analysis, but are students from Memphis and Shelby County included in this overall state data?
Yes, yeah, it is likely. Again, we don't know the exact schools that are included. As I mentioned up at the top, about 90 schools across the state are represented in this sample. We have over 1,000 schools in the state, and so it's a very small amount. However, we do know that NAEP is prioritizing a representative sample. And so in order to get the data, for example, on urban students that we're seeing here, it'll be important to sample from schools across our large urban districts, including Memphis Shelby County, as well as Metro Nashville and other areas.
One other just note I'll add on the previous slide about the performance of Black students. I just think this data is really remarkable. And again, just to sort of like reiterate the question that someone asked in the chat, Black students in Tennessee in 8th grade math are #1 in terms of improvement across the country since 2022, and are now actually ranked #1 in the country in overall achievement. Now, again, like the overall achievement level is much lower than what we would aspire to be at for performance for those students. But just to again reiterate very specifically, these are both tremendous gains for Black students in achievement over time. So the improvement that they've made from 22 to 24, and the overall ranking of students in overall achievement compared to their peers across the country. Again, just like to make clear that both are really good news here. And again, I think one of the most significant bright spots from this data is the fact that Black students in Tennessee actually now rank #1 in the country in 8th grade math. And then I see a note in the chat about whether AI could be a game changer in these numbers, which is a great question. This is a topic that we're very interested in at SCORE. And I think we certainly feel like AI could be an enabler of continually improved teaching and learning across the state. I'll just note a couple of things that we're thinking about at SCORE. One is how AI tools might be used to support student learning in areas like tutoring. As an example, one of the tools that we've been exploring on our team is Conmigo, as an example, which is a tutoring platform, an AI-driven tutoring platform for students. A second is around supporting continually improved and effective teaching. So there are a number of AI tools that are giving regular support, professional development, feedback to teachers more quickly, more regularly. We think that's a really interesting use case for great teaching. And then the third is we're excited about the ways in which AI might be used to reduce non-instructional tasks and non-instructional time that teachers are having to spend on things that really are not core instruction in the classroom. And so there are a number of tools that are being used, piloted even in Tennessee, to help reduce some of those tasks. And again, we just think more time on good instruction will be good for students, and so excited to see the ways in which some of these tools might lead to improved outcomes in the years to come as well.
And I see a couple questions here. One on how legislative initiatives can continue to support these results. I will say in the data here, again, this test was taken by students between January and March of 2024. And so one thing that we're really excited for the next NAEP assessment is to see effects of the TISA formula that first kind of took action in our schools in the 23 and 24 academic year. And so while we can't, point TISA funding to any increases this year, we're really excited to see how that may impact results positively in the future. Additionally, there's a question on the math performance. How has there kind of been a shift, or what has kind of improved those math scores? So while as a state we've passed a lot of landmark policies related to early literacy, a lot has been happening as a state kind of more behind the scenes on math as well. And so we have seen a standards update and adoption of new standards, as well as high quality instructional materials in math as well. And so we're really excited to kind of continue to see that real focus on strong instruction and high quality materials, continuing to improve our scores across math and reading.
Other thing I would just add, I know there was a question about how will the NAEP scores affect things that SCORE's thinking about around key priorities and initiatives, and did it affirm the path that we're on, or sort of get us thinking about other paths? I think our sort of top level thinking on this is it really affirms the priorities that the state has set over the last 15 years and over the last 5 years. Particularly as we see the significant improvement the state's made from 22 until 24. So things like, really a strong commitment to measuring student progress through regular assessment, including annual assessment of student outcomes, setting a high bar through high academic standards for students, and then supporting students in meeting those standards. A really focused set of attention around effective teaching, knowing that the quality of and the effectiveness of the classroom teacher is the number one in-school factor in improving student outcomes. Those are all things that have been sort of foundational to Tennessee's work over the last 15 years. And then over the last few years in particular, this really intentional focus on early grades literacy, making sure we have high quality curriculum in our classrooms, supporting interventions like tutoring to help students get caught back up. Particularly students who might have seen some impacts of lost sort of instruction time over the last 5 years or so. And then, as Lexi mentioned, some of these newer priorities around the TISA K-12 funding formula and additional investments that the state has made in that space. We just think these are all sort of signs towards continued focus and progress on these priorities. And I think we would also say there are some strategies that we know that are particularly effective with our highest need students. So I know somebody mentioned in the chat our charter schools reflected in these numbers, and Lexi can answer that question specifically. But we know that that there are many charter schools in the state that are serving our highest need students exceptionally well. So that's something that we're thinking about just as an additional strategy moving forward. I think as we also think about what other areas of focus might feel important, I think there's a lot to learn about the progress that we've made in math. And we obviously know that areas like 8th grade math are important predictors of high school and post-secondary success, particularly as we want more and more students entering the STEM fields. So that's, I think, an additional area of focus for us. And then maybe the last thing I would note is just a reminder that this data is 4th and 8th grade math and ELA. And so there are lots of other important data points that we should also be looking at, whether that's our annual TCAP assessment for students, whether that is assessments that we're using in high school to measure college and career readiness, or whether that's looking more closely at the data around what happens to students when they finish high school. I think all of those assessments and data points really help us paint a picture for how the state is doing. And one of the most important reasons to be looking at NAEP is it gives us really an apples to apples comparison in how Tennessee is doing compared to other states. And that's one of the reasons why this is such a particularly important area of focus. All right, any other questions? And we'll probably go for another minute or two before we wrap, but any other questions that folks have? Oh, there's a great question here about the teacher pipeline. And I think this is, I should have noted, this is a key area of focus that we're interested in moving forward to. We certainly know that a lot of schools and districts across the state are facing challenges around recruiting and retaining great teachers, and definitely know that this is a priority for a number of policymakers in Tennessee. It's certainly a priority for SCORE, was one of our 2025 State of Education in Tennessee priorities. So definitely think there's a lot more we can be doing to support pathways into great teaching and learn from some of the important practices the state has put in place over the last few years. And then maybe last question, Lexi, I'm wondering if you could say anything about NAEP and international rankings, or if there's any correlation there.
Yeah, absolutely. So NAEP is not directly tied to those international rankings that we might see on the PISA test, for example. That's the kind of international standard assessment. So no, NAEP does not allow us to compare internationally. Again, NAEP is really focused on allowing us to understand as a nation how we're performing and how Tennessee is comparing to other states across the US. And so would recommend checking out the PISA, that is PISA assessment data, to understand where kind of the US is falling in those international rankings. As a reminder, we will be following up after this call with a copy of the slides as well as the recording from today's webinar.
Great. Awesome. Lexi, thank you for all the work on this research. Thanks so much to all of you for being with us today. We're excited to follow up with you to share these slides and additional data. We'll have some additional information out later today. And we'll just encourage folks to feel free to reach out to us if there's anything we didn't get to, any questions we didn't get to, or additional cuts of this data that you'd be interested in seeing. This data obviously just came out this week, and we'll be continuing to look through the results to identify not only things to be particularly proud of in our work in improving student outcomes, but also areas for additional focus in the years to come. So thanks so much for being with us, and appreciate your partnership in this work. Have a great weekend.